Hi there. Let's do a little bit of a review from our last painting session. We are exploring the basic primary principles of color. So the first project that you did basically was to paint a range of 10 values. So value, again, remember, is a combination of only white and black. There's no color in it. So we have this property of color, which is value, and then the assignment that you just completed is based on the idea of mixing what we call hues. All right, so the primary hues are red, yellow, and blue. So all of these colors basically emanate from these three primaries and their different combinations. So what we're going to do now, I just want to kind of make it clear that these are two very separate color concepts. So in other words, here in value we have no hues or no colors. When you did the color wheel, you had only hue and no value. So now what we're going to do is we're going to start combining basically value with hue. So you're going to, for example, take white and add gradually the hue of red to it, or start with a gray and add red to it, and then we're going to have red combined with black. You can see here's a different one. This is done with the color blue, but again we're having the values white, gray, and black. So these are what we call tint, tone, and shade runs. One of the new kind of vocabulary words that you'll see on your list is what a tint is. So a tint is basically when you combine the value white with any hue or any color on the wheel. A tone is basically a gray plus a hue, and a shade is when you have a hue and black together. So the assignment is basically for you to pick a color from the color wheel, and that's your choice. You're basically going to be doing one color in about roughly 20 steps. It doesn't have to be exactly 20, but that's typically a pretty decent number. Sometimes people do 30 or a little bit less, but I did want to mention that you will find that you're going to get some more interesting colors if you stay away from the primaries. For example, if you use like blue-violet, or you use red-violet, or yellow-green, or blue-green, you tend to get more interesting tones and shades and tints. But what I would recommend doing is if you're going to be mixing or using one of the intermediate or secondary colors, is that you actually mix enough in some of these little jars so that you have the same color that you're working with on all three of these. All right, so the thing that I wanted to mention, remember that you always have to start with the lightest color and then work your way by adding the darker or stronger pigment to it. So when you're doing a tint run, you're always going to start with your white and add a color. When we're doing the gray, it's actually better to have a little bit lighter gray, something about like this. It's if you look at your color wheel that you have in your kit, it's actually the gray value number 8 would be my advice in terms of a guide. So the tone run, you're going to start with the gray and add the color to it. Now, because this particular run is using black, black is the strongest pigment, you will always start with whatever hue you pick and then you'll add the black to it. But the way that you lay this out on the chart will be with the values on one side and then the same pure hue over on this side. I would make the little samples probably about roughly an inch. And if you, because you're gonna, with this particular assignment now, what we're gonna do is we're going to use the smaller punch, which is, you're gonna be able to just come in off the edge like this and cut it. And then again, when you're doing this, you want to be sure that you save the remaining kind of punch things. So the biggest challenge, I guess I want to say, is not to add too much pigment right away. You want to have kind of a slow, gradual change. It's very common, especially like in doing the tint run, that you put too much red in. So the idea is to go really slow, all right? So you should see just a tiny change. Sometimes it's almost feels a little bit like it's not even noticeable, but that's okay. So then we just take and add a little tiny bit more red. And what's going to happen here is that you will be kind of gradually depleting the white paint and increasingly adding red, because what we want to do is transition all the way from the white back to a pure red. Okay, so let's be sure that you get your color mixed in there. All right, so you'll see that there's just a slow kind of small change each time that you're adding a little bit of the red. And just try to, be sure that you get it mixed up so that it's not too streaky. So if you take a look at that, you can see that it's just kind of a slow, gradual change. What you start doing is little by little, you start adding more red because you're, like I said, depleting the amount of white that's in here. And you're basically aiming to get into the red zone here. So you just have to be a little patient, and you do, by the way, also want to do this in obviously like one setting, because you don't want your paints to dry out. So now I'm, putting more red in than I did at the beginning, because I'm trying to get this group of colors basically to flip, over into the red zone eventually. out of the pink. So you can see the way that you create pink, obviously, is by adding white to it. So I'm going to get a little bit more aggressive with my red. So all of these are showing you basically that there is a huge range of what we call tints that you can make with any color. So if you start thinking about the whole color wheel, having 12 colors in it, and the fact that you can then, just by adding white, you can start to create like a whole other kind of range of colors. So we've gone from, say, one color all the way now into the point where we have made a variety of, up to 20 or 30 different types of pinks or tints from red. So you see that I'm adding quite a bit more red, but it's not making a huge difference. So I'm actually going to start putting more red into this to try to get it to start shifting more. But it is always better to go slow as opposed to going too fast, because it's difficult to go backwards on these things. So you can see that we're still kind of about in the middle here in terms of the color. So you see I'm now adding substantially more red to this. And you can see that it didn't make a huge difference, even though I added, a significant amount. But again, can you see that the idea is to make a slow transition? You don't want it to jump, too quickly. So I'm going to just be adding kind of bigger blobs of red and working my way so that my last sample is basically going to be the pure red. So I want to get this into that range. So you can see that it's not a pure red at this point, but it's a pink. So we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11. So probably, like I said, probably in the neighborhood of 20-ish samples is usually pretty good. If you go too fast, you really kind of skip over a lot of the colors in between there. And again, I would pick a color that you like so that you get to see, you know, how the color transitions and something that's pleasing to you. And just again, a reminder that you know, these are more interesting actually. It's fairly predictable that you're going to, you know, the pinks that you're going to get, for example, if you use the primaries. But for example, blue-green makes some really beautiful colors. You kind of get into that range of like teals. There's a lot of beautiful tones that come out of the blue violets as well. So we're probably fairly close here. I'm gonna do a little bit more, maybe do one more here before I kind of hit the end of the road. Clean my brush out, and then my very last swatch should be the pure red out of the bottle, okay? So there you have basically what's called a tint run using white, which is a value, and then gradually adding red to it. So at this point, once this is dry, of course, you can go and punch each of these out. My recommendation, by the way, because it's very easy to get some of these mixed up because like you can see how close the colors are, is that once you've punched it out, you know, for example, start over here and when you get your circle, punch it and then write number 1 on the back and number 2, number 3, 4, 5, and so forth, so that when you're actually going to, you know, mount it for presentation, you don't get the order of them mixed up. All right, so I'm going to just try a little bit here with the shade run, just to give you an idea of how that goes. Probably not going to be doing the entire thing, but it works exactly the same way. What I've done here is I pre-mixed basically a about a number, like I said, number 8 value gray. So it's a gray that's a little bit more on the light side as opposed to kind of in the middle. So starting about like that. And then what we're going to do is add, again, just kind of a tad of red. So now what we're doing is creating tones of red, all right? And you may not see a big shift again on the first group, but that's the idea. Painters, when they're painting, are doing a lot of subtle color mixing all the time. Personally, I think what you'll start to find is that the tone runs are really the ones that become the most interesting. So what you end up with are kind of, I don't know if you can see that quite clearly yet, but you end up with almost like a kind of lavender gray that's pretty nice. try to speed this along a little bit here for you. So the same thing is going to happen is that as you're painting, you're gradually depleting, you know, the original gray color that you had. And you're adding more and more red to the gray as you move kind of across the board, because what you want to do is have this actually is going to go all the way back to gray. So if you see, for example, here you're starting, this is a little bit darker gray, but you go through these various like gray tones, but you will end up with the red at the other end. Same here, you can see this a little bit lighter gray, but gradually goes all the way back to blue. So this is kind of how this works. So do you see? This is now going to go all the way until we hit red again. All right. At this point, I did want to talk about something in terms of the color theory, is that this starts to introduce an idea of what's called saturation or intensity of color, which is the third property of color. You can see, for example, that the pure red hue is actually quite bright and quite intense, all right? And what happens to a color, for example, you can see that the colors that we're getting, for example, in the tone run are more muted. So you've probably heard the word tonal. That means typically that it's been, you know, kind of grayed down or toned down, just like taking a loud noise and making it more mute. One way to make a color less intense or to desaturate it is to add either gray to it or white to it or black. It will always kind of dull the color down. So conversely, I could just say to you that the color wheel colors, or the original hues, are the most intense colors or the most highly saturated colors that you can have. So you know, adding a tint or creating a tint, a tone, or a shade is a way to lower the intensity or desaturate something. So those of you, for example, that are working on a computer, when you're adjusting color with the sliders and it says adjust intensity, basically what the computer is doing in many cases is either adding white to the color, adding gray to the color, or adding black to the color. So anyways, your assignment for the next week is to, you know, again, select one color, do a full tint run, a tone run, and a shade run. You don't need to put them in a straight design. I think it's probably many more creative ways that you can, you know, arrange them on the page. The only thing is that I do want you to have them in the exact order. Okay? All right, we'll have fun with the next color adventure. All righty, bye-bye.